All right. Welcome everyone to our very timely and important event today called Towards Human-Centric AI. We have a very interesting plan. It's going to be very short, but it's going to be sweet, hopefully. We start with a very timely presentation by two of our SARE academics, Bruno Dumas and Winston Maxwell, who's online with us. And the idea is to launch a report that had been published in July about the meaningful explainability of artificial intelligence. Very quickly, what does this mean? Explainability is at the core of concerns for AI ever since the AI Act has been debated. And I think part of the reason why we're having this discussion now is because of the timely nature of the discussion itself. We have trilogues tomorrow, and part of the discussion would focus around what is it that governments need to do in order to make the explanations that citizens and users receive meaningful to them when they're using AI. And so without further ado, I would just quickly want to give you the lay of the land today. We will have a quick presentation by Bruno Dumas and Winston Maxwell, and then we will have a panel discussion with some experts that I'm really excited to sort of introduce to you. We have online Katarzyna Szmilewicz from the Panopticon Foundation. We have MEP Karen Melchior with us in person. Online, we also have Alberto Pena Fernandez from the Algorithmic Transparency Center of the European Commission. And then we have Jeremy Rollison from Microsoft as well to give us an industry perspective. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bruno to explain what's in the report and to also give you a quick overview before we ask our panelists to react to it. Thanks, Bruno.
Thank you, Gautam. Hello everyone. My name is Bruno Dumas. I'm a professor at the computer science faculty at the University of Namur. As Gautam said, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the report that was released a few months ago and which is today in particular the center of attention. So we'll talk about explainability and you certainly all heard about it. We're talking about artificial intelligence systems and the issue that many of these systems, mostly the ones based on machine learning, are actually currently black boxes, and you have trouble diving into these systems to know how they work, or how they reached some kind of conclusion. And there's been a lot of discussion about explainability, as much in the computer science field than in the law field. And we'll first start maybe with a few words about from Winston, with whom we surveyed. Well, he did most of the work on that part. Surveyed regulations and how they tackle explanations. Next slide, please.
So.
And Winston, up to you.
Sorry, I have to unmute. Yes, hello everyone. Yeah, Professor Bruno Dumas and I were trying to take a cross-disciplinary look at explainability, which is actually itself unusual in the field because many times you have AI experts, AI community who talks about explainability from data science point of view. You have lawyers who talk about from a legal point of view, and sociology and so forth. And so cross-disciplinary efforts are quite interesting, and I'm glad we were able to do this with Bruno Dumas. One thing we did in the report was do a bit of an inventory of what European law already says about AI explainability. And we found that actually there's quite a bit in existing EU law. Now, of course, there's the AI Act that's coming up, and we hope it gets resolved tomorrow or day after tomorrow. But the AI Act has a whole section on transparency, and there may be a new section on explaining individual decisions. But all this is in what's going on in the background is that we have the GDPR, which was adopted a long time ago in AI terms, 2016, which already has a requirement for automated decision systems to provide meaningful information about the logic involved. We have the more recent Digital Services Act, which requires explaining the main parameters and giving a meaningful explanation of the logic used that's easily comprehensible. We have the Platform to Business regulation. Again, the main parameters have to be explained, giving reasons for their relative importance. You have to allow users to obtain an adequate understanding. And what's interesting about the Platform to Business regulation is that the European Commission actually developed detailed guidelines on what this means. What do the main parameters mean? What do you have to explain? And it's actually an example of going into the nitty-gritty details of what explainability means for a given text. The European Court of Justice last year adopted a decision regarding the PNR agreement between Canada and the EU, saying that, well, first of all, machine learning shouldn't be used in certain critical applications like anti-terror detection alerts because it's too opaque. And it's absolutely important to give the citizen who's subject to those decisions the ability to understand how the criteria work and how the programs work. And that's linked to contestability of algorithmic systems. Now, what's interesting about the European Court of Justice decision is it's based on the EU Charter, so it really transcends everything. It gives us a legal basis of explainability and a requirement of explainability that goes well beyond any given regulation, but actually applies to any context. The Platform Workers Directive has provisions on explainability. Again, the main parameters, relative importance, the regulation on online terrorist content, meaningful explanation of the functioning, Consumer Rights Directive, main parameters again. So you see meaningful coming up quite a lot. You see the word explanation coming quite a lot. And what Bruno Dumas and I tried to do was figure out what those two words mean in practice.
Yeah, and coming from my background, because I work in human-computer interaction, and computer interaction is about building interfaces. And the very first time that I hear words like meaningful or explainable, the first question I ask is for whom? Because the thing is that one explanation for someone may not be meaningful that one for someone else. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so we started the first very rough categorization of the kind of profiles for whom explanations would be interesting. And you could have, for example, human overseers. Consider, for example, this, let's say the upper case where there is collaboration between a user, could be a medical doctor, for example, collaborating with an AI-based system to detect cancer cells. Other kind of audiences would be the data science quality control teams. This is more towards computer scientists working to improve algorithms and models. Then regulators, auditors, and there we start getting into very interesting fields. So people who need to have some to be able to enter the black box that I was mentioning before without being overwhelmed by the kind of details that computer scientists would be interested in one day when they prove their models. And finally, the general audience, lay users, using AI-based systems and not being always or very rarely actually aware that they're using systems which contain artificial intelligence-based systems. And all these users are going to have different goals, different tasks. From oversight, I was talking even about collaboration before, to detecting biases, improving performance. This is more, once again, the computer science point of view. And what is interesting is that currently most explainability techniques that are existing today have been created by computer scientists for computer scientists. There is actually very little in terms of explainability techniques for non-technical users, and most of the more common techniques, I'm thinking about TSNE, for example, are incredibly complex to get into. And particularly for the lay users, questions like autonomy, trust, representation, misrepresentation, and as I was mentioning, knowing that simply knowing that you're dealing with an AI-based system is actually one of the goals, and one of the hidden goal, because the user doesn't know that he or she has this goal. And regulations, and among which the Act, are going actually to touch most of these goals there. Next slide, please. And so, and there I'm really coming with my hat from computer science, and particularly human-computer interaction. So HCI is a human-computer interaction, and we have a lot of tools actually to measure whether something is meaningful or not for someone. There's a lot of technique. They are actually borrowed from social scientists, and you can provide the answer, whether you can actually provide a kind of measure whether something is meaningful or not, considering that you identified the right audience. That's the good news. Now, the bad news is most of these techniques are actually rather statistical by nature. You won't get a straight, pure answer whether something is 100% meaningful. And they typically are more like best effort techniques. But they do exist, and you can, to a certain point, ask, for example, a company presenting an AI-based system to provide proof that to the depth of what they could achieve, yes, the explanations that they provide in their system are meaningful. But this is a risk-based approach, simply because all these techniques require you to go talk to users, do studies with users, that every single human is different. And so you're going to try to get let's say the rough curve of the bell, but certainly not the extremities. And so this is the proposal that we brought into the report. Next slide, please. And we send up to you.
Yeah, well, one thing which is often ignored is that explainability comes with a cost. So there's no free lunch. That's true in economics. It's true in explainability. And so one of the things that we highlight in the report, and that we also teach our students in AI governance, is that you really have to point out the tensions and trade-offs, and then figure out a solution for resolving those trade-offs through appropriate collegial decision mechanisms in the organization. Now, what are the trade-offs in explainability? Well, first of all, the one well-known trade-off is a trade-off between explainability and performance. You may, in certain applications, like the Court of Justice told us, actually reject certain models entirely because of their black box nature, even if the black box model might provide higher predictive accuracy. And that's a perfectly legitimate choice, but it does come at a cost in terms of predictive accuracy. Another trade-off, which is very at the center of Bruno Dumas' field of human-computer interaction, is that explainability sometimes is a double-edged sword, and it can have bad effects that we don't necessarily think about. There have been a number of experiments where users are given explanations of computer-generated recommendations, and the group who got the explanation actually becomes much more complacent and less vigilant. which is exactly the opposite of what we want. We want users to be vigilant and critical of algorithmic output. And by giving an explanation, you can actually lull people into complacency and they become more stupid and less vigilant. Another trade-off that Bruno highlighted is that you'll have to put the cursor somewhere about satisfying most people's needs for explainability, but not everyone's. And who's going to decide that? You know, what are the groups that might not be addressed by a given solution of explainability? Some people may have special needs, and we have to have a way of addressing that. But one thing is for sure, you can't have a single solution of explainability that makes everybody happy. And then finally, explainability has to be balanced against protection of trade secrets, data security, cybersecurity. Sometimes if you give too much information, we all know that sometimes the algorithm can be gamed by users. And we don't want too much manipulation. If you give too much transparency, it facilitates manipulation. So all these trade-offs have to be identified, and then there has to be a mechanism to decide what are the right trade-offs, knowing that people will, any choice on these trade-offs will be contestable by at least someone.
Next slide, please. And so to conclude this quick overview of what we discuss in the report, just a few key messages. First, and I would say foremost, as soon as you start talking about explainability, there will be users involved, and identifying the kind of users that you expect to be the audience will also lead to their needs or their wishes. That's the first thing. The second, there are ways to measure meaningfulness. There are ways to measure whether an explanation is speaks to the users that you identified. These approaches are best effort, so don't expect black or white answers from them, but they are already a very good step in, at least in our opinion, in the right direction. And finally, as discussed by Winston, there are many trade-offs. As soon as we step into the field of explainability, and these also need to be discussed with stakeholders and documented. And I guess that concludes the academic part of this presentation. Gautam, I think.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Bruno and Winston. There's a link to the report in case for the online audience as well, if you want to have a look. Please have a look at the report because it's quite timely and very, very detailed in trying to unentangle these different issues on explainability. So now with that, without further ado, we will move to the panel discussion. We have a very exciting panel because we have very different angles by which explainability can be addressed. And for the panel discussion, I just wanted to sort of trace the evolution of explainability, starting from sort of the discussions you had in jury and in other committees at the parliament, as well as at the other institutions before the proposal even came out, and then, you know, to come up with your position in the jury. Karen has been leading this file in jury and trying to bring explainability to the forefront. And today you can see that that's an element of the parliament position in the negotiation. So Karen, could you please react to this presentation and let us know how explainability can be relevant for AI?
I think it was a very interesting presentation, and I really liked as well the going through the existing legislation where we require explainability, because it shows that if we are making decisions that have an impact on people's lives, on their health, on their social benefits, then we need to be able to explain how we came to this decision. In the report and the presentation, there is you ask us to define the users. I think we also need to define the subjects, because the users of the AI might be a company or a public authority, a government, and then the subjects is the consumer or the citizen. In most public administrative law, in most public law, you would have a requirement to be able to reason your decision made by a public authority, and also that you would be able to appeal that decision to a higher instance, or even to take the authority, or in some cases a company, to court. And there I think it's important to say, okay, for certain high risks uses of AI, we need to require explainability. And I think it was quite interesting that you said that a lot of the sort of definitions of explainability were used for computer scientists to understand what the computer scientists, either themselves or colleagues, had been doing. And I think we need to have a requirement for explainability before you want to use AI for certain high-risk uses. If you cannot explain the decision that you've made, whether somebody's going to be getting social benefits, if they're going to get access to housing, what they're going to be paying in their property tax, example from Denmark, then it's very difficult for the citizens to understand and trust the decisions that public authorities are making on their behalf. And there I think it's really crucial and unavoidable that we require explainability. I think certain other uses of AI where you can sort of adjust as you go along, then the requirement for explainability would be less. I think we need, I came across an interesting concept of technology using to regulate technology, sort of regulatory technology. And I think we need to have something that will help us oversee all of these digital pieces of legislation, and so that we can implement and enforce them, because I think that's going to be the next step. And I think two other points that were being made was concerning context. And I think AI cannot understand context. And that's why, for example, for content moderation, I think it's quite dangerous to rely on AI for content moderation, which was also what the European Court of Justice said. And then also regards to human oversight. It needs to be meaningful, and that is a challenge when we, in legislation, say that we want to have meaningful human oversight, because we need to enable the humans to actually do it with purpose and meaning.
That's the perfect segue to my next speaker, because Alberto has been working now on setting up and putting together the sort of infrastructure that the European Commission needs in order to implement fully the AI Act. And I mean, part of the Center for Algorithmic Transparency's mission is to really ensure that the explanations that AI systems are providing are meaningful, but also the AI systems themselves are human-centric to some extent. So maybe I'll move to you, Alberto, if you don't mind, to give us an overview of how is it going in Sevilla, and what's the plan for the Commission to implement the AI Act.
Well, in Sevilla, it's nice. The weather is much better than in Brussels, sorry to say. Now, let me just first, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. That's probably important to frame a bit what we are doing. Secondly, let me I think it's important to say basically that we are living some kind of historical milestone in the artificial intelligence in Europe. So in my case, this is personal. I feel like being Neil Armstrong putting his feet on the moon and saying that's a small step for our European Union and one giant leap for artificial intelligence kind. So that's the setup mindset I'm living in. Now, what I do is I lead the Joint Research Center unit inside the European Commission, which is called the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency. And what you say is true, is partially true, because we have two axes. And it has been created under the Digital Services Act. That's the main purpose of the existence of the ECAT. Now, we as well provide scientific support to what it's been the building of the text of the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is not yet, I mean, tomorrow maybe it will be the final milestone, we'll see. But we are on those sides, on both sides of the coin, if you like. On one side, we provide scientific support to the AI Act drafting, and on the other, we are supporting the enforcement of an existing law, which is the Digital Services Act. In both cases, actually, we deal with algorithms. And algorithms are, in the end, artificial intelligence. So the experience we are gaining through the Digital Services Act is very valid to the next step, which is a bigger scale actually, is the whole artificial intelligence ecosystem. And that's where we stand. Maybe I can elaborate there here, but it's a bit on the, we are basically the science part of the European Commission. We feed the policymakers to build whatever text in policy making based on factual information, on research and on proven information. And that's our role. I probably can stop there and then continue later.
Sure. No, that's really helpful to introduce your objectives and mission. And I think with that sort of very important explanation of what the Commission can do, I think it's also important to bring in civil society. And Katarzyna, I'm personally a big fan of your work, and I'm sure there's many who are watching this who think the same way. So I just wanted to go quickly to you and ask you, is the AI Act fit for purpose from the perspective of meaningful explainability? And what is the civil society perspective of this? Because of course, you have this idea that, we will have the best explanation for most of the people. But then you have this danger of excluding marginalized communities or minorities and so on. And especially in high-risk use cases, it becomes very important for having much more accountability and explainability designed right at the beginning of the or the inception or the product development of such a system. So what are your views, and what is the Panopticon Foundation doing on this? Thanks.
Thank you for excellent question with a thesis built in that I can immediately agree with. So in the first place, explainability should not be a holy grail in this discussion about regulating AI, because it is important tool to achieve other goals, but it's not, at least for us, it's not end goal in itself. I fear that it's often used as a smokescreen in this debate to hide even more important battles, such as how can we keep these systems accountable for decisions they generate? How can we negotiate trade-offs that are made by system designers? How can we make sure that these systems do not make mistakes or convey bias? Or how can we ensure democratic access to these systems and meaningful competition in AI markets? So this is all far more important, and I believe that AI Act has been designed to address these bigger goals, with explainability being one of the tools, which, as you rightfully suggested in your question, is not should not be restricted to one aspect, which is explainability towards individuals. As we all know, it has not even been there from the beginning. It was a big fight in the parliament to include explainability towards individuals. And I do think this is important. Don't get me wrong. I do not undermine that objective, but I want to stress that meaningful explainability has layers. And these layers, they start from the basic layer, which is explaining main parameters, and warning individuals affected by the systems that they come in interaction with AI. And this is, again, something we haven't really had in the AI Act, with exception of few types of systems like chatbots, for example, or deepfakes, if anybody ever notified people that this is a deepfake, what they created, right? So on that basic layer, we still have things to fight for in the AI Act. But this is where transparency only starts. The real meaningful transparency happens on the what I would call advanced layer, and this is not for everybody, because general audience should not even be interested in the main parameters of these systems or technical documentation. The real interest kicks in when we have something to gain. We as watchdog organizations, as civil society, we have something to gain because it's our job to fight for AI accountability, and same for ECAT or European Commission. So for us, meaningful transparency is something far more advanced than what we have in general explanations. We would need access to technical documentation, even if redacted, to protect business goals. But this is where the key design choices are or should be explained. And this is where we can see what trade-offs has been made, what political decisions possibly are hidden in seemingly technical parameters. And this sort of analysis can be done by independent auditors and researchers if we have access to the right data. So this is meaningful for us. But when you think individuals affected with bias or a mistake in credit scoring or employment decision, then why would they care about technical documentation or even learning about many parameters that will sound technical to them? For them, what's meaningful is to understand what data of themselves, what personal data had impact on decision they've been subjected to, who made this decision, whether there is human oversight they can appeal to, right? So these are very different explanations, and we should never conflate them into one bucket. So right now, AI Act has bits and pieces of these layers, but this is not comprehensive, and this is not this is certainly not enough, because we are only talking about high-risk systems, and access to key technical documentation will be reserved for the regulator and for system owners, which in our opinion should be made more open for independent researchers.
That's a very good point, and I think that sort of leads me to my next question, which is to get an industry perspective about explainability. Of course, you know, this has not been a mandatory requirement ever since the inception of technology, and Microsoft has been putting out products with AI in it for several years now. And given, I mean, Microsoft's profile in the world as one of the primary B2B software, as well as being a primary B2C player, it's quite important to get your view on how Microsoft is trying to sort of square the circle of explainability to some extent. How do you make things meaningful to your customers and useful to the end users, but at the same time, you know, meet other expectations of regulators, of civil society, of the kinds of stuff that Katarzyna was also speaking of. Thanks, Jeremy.
Well, thanks for the question, because I was struggling to understand where I should best come in. You know, I think it's quite a broad concept, right? And I'm glad to see some of the other legislative proposals that were listed up there. It's not just the AI Act that looks at this space, and appreciate that you mentioned, you know, there have been a lot of products and services that have been released for some time that are based on AI. But explainability, I think, I don't want to confuse anyone and say, well, it's context specific, but it is sometimes use specific, whether it's high risk. I'm not the academic here, but I would imagine, and it seems to me to be common sense, that the higher the risk in an outcome context on a data subject, fundamental rights implications, critical infrastructure implications and the like, you know, there's going to be a higher degree of the need for explainability. How was this designed? What were the mitigation measures that were taken into account all the way from the start? And I think one of the ways that we've done that across all of our AI services, you know, we have had a team in place looking at this for many, many years now, and has released a standard. And that includes the type of impact assessment templates that our engineering teams and others need to apply to any product or service they may be developing. And then it's a drilled down thing, right? So there's some, depending on you answer yes or no to this, you're going to have different questions that come up, and there's going to be different measures that you have to put in place, and there's going to be different type of, you know, data transparency that's going to be necessary. So I would come back to what was said a little bit earlier, that, you know, if you're operating a search engine, you know, how do we provide results? There's a degree of explainability there. A lot of that is still machine learning based. If you're talking about a generative AI application, you know, what type of data went into that? You know, what kind of instructions were given? How is it intended to be used? Different sets of explainability. If you're providing another generative AI service that's creating images or creating audio files or text, once again, the list might look a little bit different. I do think the human centricity part is important because it comes up. You know, at the end of the day, we do want to make sure it's clear that these are seen as tools to help support human uses. So if you're talking about loan applications or medical diagnosis, I think we still believe, and I think most people believe this, I hope they do, that, you know, this is still a tool that helps doctors make that diagnosis. It's a tool that helps a bank make a loan decision. But the responsibility is still going to be on the person making that decision. Now, they're going to need to be able to say more than, oh, well, you know, I just did whatever the machine said. That's not going to be acceptable. And if a lawyer were to show up in court and say that there was a biased outcome here, a discriminatory outcome, and say, well, that was the AI, I think that's going to be a bad day in court for that lawyer. And those customers, if we look at them that way, you know, we do have customers across these different industries and across those spaces. You know, they're going to demand of us a degree of transparency and explainability, if you want to use that term, to understand what tool am I procuring? You know, how did you build this? How reliable is it? How much time and effort am I going to need to spend in checking the veracity? And how am I going to be able to explain that to a patient or to a judge or whomever it might be? So I heard context specific earlier, and I don't want to confuse some of the keywords because I know the report also looked at that and the difference between kind of local and global considerations. So I don't want to use keywords that mean different things. I think it is kind of use specific.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it sort of ties into what Katarzyna was also saying about how this was not even an issue while the early negotiations were taking place, because of the fact that often you have the kinds of explanations you need in the products that you're using, and you have companies providing these products that are doing a good job at you know, retaining their customers and making sure that their products are useful. So I'm just curious to know the sort of backstory of this concept coming up in jury. And I mean, I know, Karen, you were obviously instrumental in those discussions. So I mean, the question essentially is, how should we make, or rather, how should the AI Act play a role in improving explainability for citizens, but also for industry? And do you think, given the fact that AI is sort of rapidly, you know, evolving, you have new, much more powerful applications, much more powerful tools, technical tools. How do you think this is sort of evolving? Are we fit for purpose? Are we there with the AI Act now that, you know, the jury opinion is taken into account, or what do you think?
Well, I mean, as Katarzyna was saying, explainability is a tool for other goals. And we were looking from a sort of legalistic point of view. I mean, if you want to be able to appeal a decision, if you want to be able to question what has been done, then you need to be able to sort of look underneath the car bonnet and see, well, what was the technicalities, what was the algorithm, what was the data that was being used in order to reach that decision.
Right.
Because otherwise you don't have anything to base your decision to go to court with on, because you don't know, well, you have a decision, but you don't know how it reached that, and you don't know how to challenge it.
Right.
So coming from a sort of legal committee point of view, sort of seeing, okay, there'll be decisions that will be made using artificial intelligence. There'll be decisions made on high-risk areas, sectors, uses, and we want to be able to enable people to challenge those decisions. And we also, when we were discussing this, there was the case on from the Netherlands on social benefits.
Right.
That had come out, and we could see the need for being able to allow citizens to question decisions made by governments. And I think one of the dangers with digitalization and artificial intelligence is not so much the development of the technology, but the use of the technology and the choices made by sort of the product owners. So if you have politicians in a municipality or in a government saying, well, we want to combat child sexual exploitation. We want to combat terrorism, social fraud. Well, we have technology, we have computers, they're very intelligent, more than us, so we just use them to solve our problems. And when we use them, it's much cheaper and faster, so therefore we don't need as many people. And then you have a really bad situation where you have technology, you don't actually know what is going to be using as data, how the decisions are going to be reached, and at the same time you're removing the human oversight to actually challenge the decision being made. Because if you have somebody sitting in a job center making a decision based on artificial intelligence, or just sort of mining data from tons of documents and databases, then you need to make sure that you allow the person sitting in front of the computer to be able to take a proper decision, that they have the time and that they're given the authority to say, well, the computer says yes, but I want to say no, or the opposite, so that you don't sort of end up in an episode of The Office. And on trade secrets, I mean, this was one of the key issues in our exclusive competence in URI, where it's sort of like, yes, of course we need to protect crucial trade secrets for our industries, both within Europe but also elsewhere, but it cannot be so that everything is a trade secret and we cannot request explainability or insight into data sets and algorithm of the AI being used. And I think I like the reference to the ECAT, that it's both the DSA and the AI Act. When we were doing our own initiative reports, trying to influence the Commission on their legislation, we were, some of us, suggesting that, I mean, if we want to have somebody at a European level regulating these pieces of legislation and enforcing them, then I mean, there's going to be algorithms in both the DSA Act, the DSA and the AI Act. So I mean, couldn't we do one structure for both of them? And it seemed like, even though we didn't convince the majority or the Commission at the time, that in practice this is what is happening. So yeah, so these are sort of where the explainability and the work that we've been doing on trade secrets sort of came from. And I think it's also important that we insist on having access to these information, just as, for example, pharmaceutical companies or car companies say that part of the way that they build their products is trade secrets. We still allow authorities and governments to look into the nuts and bolts of their products in a way where we protect their secrets, and this should also be possible for AI.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. I mean, I worked for many years on data for good initiatives with leading tech companies, and it is very possible for industry to make a very good difference by sharing data sets and making sure that civil society has the right tools to do audits and to check if their systems are working and so on. Alberto, I think I want to ask you this question that Karen just brought up, which is the link between the DSA and the AI Act and your role essentially as one of the key pieces of making sure that industry is enforcing some of these algorithmic transparency requirements. How do you think, or how do you see this going in the future? Do you have a good relationship now with industry? Are you able to get the kinds of information that you will be able to in the future on a mandatory basis? And I guess the last question on that is, other than sort of supervision, are there other use cases for the kinds of data sharing that you would end up doing, or the kinds of relationships that you would build with industry?
Yeah, so many questions, so many
Sorry,
answers to
we have
give.
very little time.
No worries, no worries. Let's start with the experience of the Digital Services Act, because we look a lot on certain platforms, risks, and the risk has been mentioned already. Biased information, misinformation spreading, copyright threatened, personal privacy, personal data, cybersecurity, etc., etc., etc. So the Digital Services Act gives us the power to ask the companies for that information, be it data or access to algorithms. We call it inside the opening the black box. That's very simple. And with that power, we can access that data ourselves, or eventually give it to what we call BET researchers or certified researchers that can access as well the data, which is in the process of creating via delegated act. So that information could be as well accessed by people outside the center. Now, with that experience and use cases you mentioned, we already seen that, I mean, behind every system we talk about, there is algorithms, many algorithms, different kinds of algorithms. And they do so many tasks. They have so many different data sets used that is so complex inside that we need what we call a multidisciplinary look at it. So that's what we are doing. We are looking at from many different angles and gathering all that information and building our own methodologies, methods, and eventually even tools to help us in the way. We will put that back to the scientific world once we completed the research area, and that will be the basis for the next step. The next step is Artificial Intelligence Act. So we are at a very well position right now to start looking at that from a broader perspective, not just the Digital Services Act. So I can go on and on, but I think that should be enough to spark.
That's very, very clear. And that sort of brings me to my next question. And this one's to Jeremy and to Katarzyna. Maybe you can go first. I think, so I guess we sort of coming to grips with the need for explainability and the need for meaningful explanations, let's say, and the drawbacks of this. But I guess now the question is, as AI improves, as we have, generative AI, we have very powerful foundation models being released. It becomes more and more important to retain this human centricity and to retain explainability. How do you think industry should sort of approach this? Is there a way to sort of shed more light on the black box that exists in these models, or is there a way to put some protections on them? What sort of measures would you suggest?
I think I would start by hoping that the debate perhaps goes in the direction of the safety brakes that I think you want to have on these systems. And we use that term to talk about the high risk, the tip of the spear, the highly capable models that are coming out, the AI systems that are powering things like critical infrastructure. We use the example of elevators, which were quite revolutionary when they came about, but who wanted to get in a box that was operated by a machine, right? You didn't trust that. Well, it took a lot of time and effort and standards development and the like to make sure there are actually brakes on these things, and they've been vetted and they've been tested, and then folks feel safer using it. AI is a lot more complex than an elevator, but we have to come up with safety brakes, and those need to be clear and understandable. How do you know that this thing that you tell me has so much compute power, can do all these amazing things? How do I know it's really under human control? What are the safety brakes? So there's going to be an element of explainability that I think the debate will have to move to in that direction. And then I'd come back to what we talked about earlier. Which uses are we going to see a need for the most degree of explainability? I come back to that doctor example. I just can't imagine sitting there and wanting to hear my doctor say that, well, that was what the AI system said, and not being able to share anything more with me. I just don't see how anybody's going to let that type of scenario emerge. I really don't. I hope we don't come to that. Now, the degree to which the doctor is going to say, well, there's neural networks involved and things like that.
But isn't that actually the situation with the attribution of livers in the UK? That it's an AI system that decides who gets a liver transplant, and the doctors can't explain it.
If that's the case, and I'm not familiar with the example, then yeah, there's a problem there. There's a problem there. If somebody says, you have a diagnosis of X, and I want to know how well that was vetted, who looked at it, and I think when we talk about rights to human intervention in a GDPR context, that is somewhat similar, because you should have a right to say, well, you know what, with all due respect, I know that has 99.9% accuracy according to that little document you showed me, but I'd like to have that vetted by somebody else. I just can't imagine that patients, data subjects, loan applicants are going to want to live in a world where you don't get more information than that. And I actually think, the good news, I think if you're trying to sell into those markets, you're going to need to have that as part of your sales pitch, right? So I do think there's an incentive there. But I would focus on the safety brakes element, because I do think increasingly the human control side of it, I want to make sure that everyone is very clear on, where's the kill switch for something like this.
No, and that makes a lot of sense, because, the AI Act is premised on product safety legislation. There's a lot of NLF for people that don't know what that is. It's the new legislative framework. It's a very EU nerdy thing to say, but I think, so that's sort of the genesis of the AI Act. But I think the discussion has sort of moved to some extent, and you mentioned the fundamental rights aspect. It is more than an elevator to some extent, because it has impacts that you don't really understand beyond the first, the second, and third degree. Katarzyna, maybe I come to you on this. What do you think are some of the things we need to pay attention to, in addition to the stuff that you've already heard, that we are already paying attention to in the AI Act and in other pieces of legislation? What would be your advice to sort of European policymakers?
Definitely, my advice is not to be frightened by the black box concept and not to let away companies too quickly without explaining key design decisions. Even for most sophisticated systems, including foundation models, we can demand, for accountability purposes, revealing decisions made by designers in terms of what data was used, how systems are optimized, what trade-offs are built in terms of accuracy, errors that are accepted or not accepted, because these decisions, they will have implications for results that system generates. including which conditions or in which circumstances the systems may fail us or lead to discrimination. So that discussion can happen even if we have so-called black box systems, which learn in a way that we can't really trace or deeply understand. So technical complexity does not exclude political accountability of the systems. And I think this is very important discussion, which is facilitated to some extent by AI Act, but it is a political discussion. It is a power play between system owners, system providers, systems users, where often users will be the public authorities representing humans, or smaller companies with real clients out there, and the providers will be the big companies that own all these deeply hidden decisions. So one is the conversation about objectives and trade-offs built in the systems. The other is human oversight. It's very easy to demand that, to say, yes, before the bank makes its final decision on credit, human needs to be involved. Same goes for a doctor or a judge or a policeman. But we know that humans today are not prepared to make their own assessment of suggestions or recommendations generated by AI systems. And it's a huge challenge which won't be solved by legislation, because it's educational challenge or business development and recruitment challenge to prepare humans to be critical and to have explainability designed for system controllers. It's a very different thing than explainability we have discussed so far. So this is another thing we need to be aware of, and that could inform decisions when it comes to funding of innovation, funding of educational programs, different sort of decisions also made by EU that are not about legislation, but more about developing new area in the market, new type of specialists and translators we will desperately need very soon. And then finally, there are impact assessments, which we have, and hopefully they are to stay in the AI Act, meaningful impact assessments. Again, we can write them in the law, but practice will make all the difference here. And once again, this is about humans designing impact assessments and performing them well, or performing them as bureaucratic exercise. So this is, I think, back to business ethics and good practices that can be promoted by most progressive companies to show that, yes, we can do good impact assessment, and then based on that, we build the safety brakes. I'm all in favor of safety brakes, but in order to know where they are needed, we need to understand what the risks are, and that tends to be more complicated.
That's a great point, and I think it sort of leads me to my final question, which I also found in the Q&A online, and I think it's quite relevant to our scholars here, Bruno and Winston. So maybe you can take it first. The question basically is, I'm struggling with the idea of a user-centered explainability and meaningfulness explained in the document, in your report, that is. Many, if not all, of the criteria in measuring meaningfulness rely on users' perceptions, so whether the users are satisfied or not. But the explanation should not only be plausible and acceptable to the user, but it should also be a real reflex or a sort of image of the real reasons behind a decision. And this is quite an interesting question, because I don't think we fully understand as humans how AI learns to some extent. I mean, we kind of know, but we find it hard. I mean, I remember watching the AlphaGo documentary in 2016, and people were sort of commenting while this was happening that the plays that the computer was making on Go were very non-human-like, and the style of play was very non-human. So it's possible that you come to a decision which is fair and which satisfies the end user, but is this enough? Like, would it explain how the decision is actually being made? That's kind of a philosophical question. And is this even relevant? Like, do you need to update your report and include this kind of analysis, or do you think it's not necessary?
Winston, do I go first? Yep. Okay. So that's so many questions in one. What is actually interesting in that question is that it underlines a lot of reflections that were shared in the panel, and in particular, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that AI-based systems are getting more and more complex. I just checked GPT-4, so GPT-4 is the algorithm behind the current version of ChatGPT, has 1 trillion parameters. And if you just ask for the parameters, like some regulations do, I don't know a single scientist who can give you an explanation just based on the parameters, which means that you need different ways, and I would call them higher level explanations. I did mention to give roughly, very quickly, kind of the different possibilities that exist currently in terms of explanations. I did mention one which is used a lot by computer scientists, which is basically a visualization on a 2D space, so a 2D image from the multidimensional vectors that make up the more complex AI algorithms. So imagine points in 100,000 dimensions, which are compressed into dimensions. The thing is, even those pictures are not very explaining by them. And this is for the computer scientists. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, if we take lay users, the kind of explanations which currently work well are simple text explanations. Imagine that you go, for example, on a website like Amazon, you buy, and then Amazon recommends you some products, and then the website tells you, okay, you were recommended this because you like this and this and this, and we realize that you always buy this particular brand, and we thought that this one would be interesting. This works very well. It hides, but it hides 99.9% of the complexity of what's been happening behind. And I think it was Karina who mentioned education as something quite important. There is, it's extremely important, in my opinion. This is also something that we're working actually in my university. But you cannot rely only on education. There is also, I would say that, sorry, I'm looking looking at you there. Also on the side of the companies have also to make sure that in their products are as are well, I hate that term, but as user friendly as possible. And there has been kind of a trend going in that direction, but in terms of explainability, there is a lot of work. So in terms of research, we're slowly getting to the algorithms which are not complex enough that they can be understood by everyone, and still, relatively speaking, giving a lot of information on what has been happening.
Right.
There is, I would think, a strong discourse to be made to the public that AI-based systems are huge equations with huge quantities of data, and certainly not the kind of killer robots that we tended to see in pop culture. And also from regulators also, and this is going to be quite hard, making sure that the regulation written today stays relevant in the next few years, considering the absolutely crazy rate of advance in the research field.
Thank you. Winston, do you have anything to add, or I can move to my final question?
Go ahead and pose your final question.
All right. And this is to everyone, so we'll take turns. I was reading yesterday that the GPAI, so the Global Partnership on AI, is working on sort of standard contracts for AI that is being used across borders, especially in advanced AI systems. And this is a way to sort of bring this discussion on explainability, because if you have standard explanations or contracts that businesses can use with each other when they sort of trade in AI systems, if there is a way to explain that is coherent and convergent across borders, it could be helpful as a next step for policymakers to work. And so, I mean, I could start with you, Karen. Do you think the institutions need to now focus on trying to bring convergence internationally on this idea of explanation? Or do you think explainability is location or context or culture or border specific? It's a tricky question because it depends is the right answer, but yeah.
I think Katarzyna's point that explainability is a tool to achieve other goals also holds here.
Yeah.
We need to look at what is it that we want from the explainability. And I think if we want to have use of AI across the world, and we need that because anything digital is global from the get-go, and that's especially true on AI that needs so many resources to actually develop. So I think we need to start developing it, but having a convergence globally. But I think we need to figure out what we think ourselves first in order to have that definition to start a convergence from.
Understood. Maybe Alberto, do you want to come in and talk a little bit about how the ECAT would sort of work with other regulatory agencies to try to come up with convergence in the way that explainability works? Is there a way to sort of look at an AI system and say, just like in, I don't know, in data protection, you have the idea of adequacy. Is there such an idea that could be helpful for convergence on this?
Okay, there is no easy question, no easy answer to that, but I will try. Actually, I like one of the famous quotes of Leonardo da Vinci, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. So I will start from there. Basically, what we do, we started with agreeing on a definition of what artificial intelligence is. That's one of the basics, and we still are not there. So, okay, so we start from that. Second, once we have a definition, we go into the standardization process. So creating a standards so that we can refer to and then say, yes, we are compliant, no, we are not compliant, yes, we are this thing, yes, or not, we are not this thing. Within that package, we already have some of the, let's say, paths towards trying to understand what is behind. I'm not saying we are blind because we have been looking already at systems, artificial intelligence systems. So we know already some of the elements we can look at to classify or to see what is happening inside, but not for all cases, at least not yet. But that will happen. That's what we expect. And that's what we are building towards that. And that's where ECAT is working. And we are not alone. As you said, we are in contact with other similar to us centers or organizations, institutes, academia, scientific, and we are building on that. Where we will end, the future is still to be written.
Absolutely, it is still to be written. Jeremy, you mentioned, I mean, you have standards already internally to try to, go through the responsible AI product development process, to put products on the market and so on. Do you think you would meet success in trying to bring these standards up to the international level and to try to bring convergence where, it becomes the lay of the land, essentially how you would do your business?
I wanted to talk about the convergence point. I mean, to answer your question, sure. I mean, those standards and the language there reflects our own experience, but also regulatory requirements that we've had. I mean, they've been inspired. You'd see some inspiration in some of that language from what we've engaged in GDPR compliance and the like. So they kind of grow together, right? I wouldn't take credit for our standard being just something we wrote. Definitely, you'd see a lot of similar language in there to what you're seeing elsewhere, and I think we'd love to contribute to that. But I do think this point, and we could do a separate panel on this, and one day we will. The global convergence point is important, but I think Alberto is right. It's not just agreeing on the definition of AI, then it's agreeing on the definition of high risk, right? And then it's agreeing on the definitions of critical infrastructure even. But I think for those highly capable models, the more that we can have an agreement and a convergence on that, the better, right? These are ecosystems at the end of the day that depend on infrastructures, perhaps located in one jurisdiction, talent located in another, users, customers located maybe in one or across borders. So international standards are going to be important. And one of the things that I think there's a big opportunity there for is, especially when folks like to talk about this as one jurisdiction going in that direction or another doing this or another doing that, there's an opportunity to create a global norm around that. And I think there's more like-minded folks across the globe than there isn't. And I think there's a big opportunity there. So I look at the international convergence space as one to really prioritize. Yep.
Sounds good. Maybe Katarzyna, do you want to come in and give your last word on standards and the need for convergence internationally on this subject?
It is a huge challenge, of course, and probably we should not expect much more convergence in this area than we have in other areas of international politics. So that's to start with. But as the Bletchley Park meeting recently in the UK showed, maybe we actually arrived at the point where the big players who do not represent the same approach to developing AI, they still represent the same approach to safety, to basic safety, the same way we agreed on something when it comes to nuclear weapons. So maybe on that level, such convergence is possible. When it comes to technical standards, we all know they have been developed and they will be developed because that's partly what AI Act requires or relies on to happen. And then the danger here is not so much that we don't have them, but that these are weak standards, or these standards change the burden of proof and push it again to consumers, weak stakeholders that will have to come and say, even though the system in question it complies with technical standards, it's still harmful or biased or discriminatory. So the challenge now we have in Europe is to differentiate which elements of compliance can be dealt with by technical standards and which of them need to be dealt with by courts, by regulators such as EU itself, European Commission as the regulator, and by impact assessments, human rights impact assessments that are not eaten by technical standards.
Understood. Okay, that's a sort of wrapping up the panel question. And Winston, do you want to come in on the question on standards? Do you think there is ways to sort of bring convergence given there are these elements in EU laws already?
Yeah, I've had the pleasure over the last 6 months to work with the OECD on a project which is working to bring together data protection communities around the world and AI communities, centered on the AI recommendation of the OECD and then the privacy guidelines of the OECD. And I'm really pleased to see that there is actually a strong possibility of convergence. Not on everything, but on a lot of things, the OECD members on those committees are really speaking similar languages as we are in Europe.
No, absolutely. And so I think, looking forward, it becomes more and more important that we move towards human-centric AI, as our panel is called. And I think over time we will see that the kind of work that we have done now will have ramifications that will last for a few decades probably, because it's going to be baked into the expectations that people have when they encounter AI. So I think in that sense it's quite an exciting time. And so I would just like to say thank you again to all of my wonderful panelists, and it's been a great discussion, and I think there's going to be a lots more to discuss even after the negotiations conclude, because there's a whole lot of uncertainty in terms of how the AI Act would be implemented in the real world. So I'm sure that we're going to reach out to all of you again and have a part 2 of this at some point. But thank you again to the panelists, and thank you to the authors as well, and for producing the report. So thank you for being here, and we'll catch you again next time. Just before you leave, there is a final word, which is on our upcoming events. We have a couple of very exciting events to announce today. One is called the Digital Platform Summit. This is sort of leading up to all of our work that we have done on the DSA and the DMA, and as we move towards implementation, it will become very important to have these conversations. And then this is on the 17th of January, so please put it into your calendar. And then we will have on the 22nd of February the SARE Foundation Summit. This summit will be focused on emerging technologies, foundational technologies, including AI, cloud, and virtual worlds. So we will catch you then, and until then, have a good Christmas, and Hope to see you soon.